Alrighty, welcome everyone. Welcome everyone to tonight's Jeez Louise session. Jeez Louise is a series that was born in 2002 to encourage more women to get into comedy and support those already there, and then has extended over the past few years to encompass women, non-binary people, and all manner of LGBTQIA plus people at the Melbourne International Comedy Festival. Tonight is co-presented by Melbourne International Comedy Festival and the Wheeler Centre, where we are now. And of course, the building that we're in and this city sits on land that was stolen and never ceded. So we would like, on behalf of the Comedy Festival, on behalf of the Wheeler Centre, myself and all of the panellists, to acknowledge that this always was, always is, and always will be Aboriginal land. Currently, we're sitting on Wurundjeri country, the speakers of the Woiwurrung language, and very close to the border of Boonwurrung country, speakers of the Boonwurrung language. So we acknowledge those countries, cultures, languages, and their elders past, present, and emerging leaders. And particularly if any of you have been to any Melbourne International Comedy Festival shows so far this season or are planning to, you may have heard the wonderful voice of Uncle Jack Charles giving a welcome and acknowledgement of country. And included in that is the message that Indigenous and First Peoples on this continent and in this region of the world have been telling stories, making performance and doing comedy long before this nation called Australia existed. So we acknowledge always was, always will be Aboriginal land. So as I was saying, welcome tonight to Jeez Louise. This edition of the Jeez Louise series is called Transplaining. Trans, non-binary and gender diverse comedians and performers are standing up and stepping out. As the world evolves its understanding of gender identity, preferred pronouns and social norms, gender-transcendent stars are reaching wider and more diverse audiences and garnering critical acclaim. So tonight, to further interrogate, understand, celebrate and discuss their careers, Jeez Louise Transplaining brings together an incredible panel of writers and performers. We have Chloe Black, Ollie Reason, and Scout Boxall. And tonight, I should introduce myself. For those of you who don't know me, shame on you. My name's Mama Alto. I'll be your host X with the most X tonight. That's a little niche joke for the woke amongst you. So tonight we'll be discussing lived experiences and sharing stories from page to stage. So as I was saying, the Jeez Louise series, born in 2002, gets to the heart of some of these issues in the comedy and entertainment scene. Over the past 18 years, women and LGBTQIA plus comedians have been welcomed onto stages and into writers' rooms in increasing numbers, spaces that were traditionally the domain of what we would say male, pale and stale. This is not in deference to political correctness, as some might cynically proclaim, but because the wit and skill of these artists make great comedy. We'll discuss comedy's potential to hold space for all comedians and as a vehicle for speaking truth. And just a reminder for anyone here and anyone who may be listening later on, this event will be available as part of the festival's online program from the 15th of April onwards. So I might take this opportunity to introduce you to each of our panellists and then lead with an opening question. So I'm just going to go in order from nearest to furthest, so proximity means that you're unlucky first, Chloe. Chloe Black began her stand-up career in Adelaide at the famed Rhino Room over 20 years ago. So you must have begun when you were 2 or 3 years old. She was a Raw Comedy National finalist in 2001, although she may have performed back then under another name. She has performed at the Melbourne International Comedy Festival, Adelaide Fringe and the Edinburgh Fringe Festival. She is a broadcaster on Edge Radio in Hobart as co-host of Film Central. She was an original participant at the inaugural Afters Talent Camp in 2018. That's the Australian Film and Television School. She's writer and creator of web series Transferred, which is currently in development with Screen Australia and Electric Yak Productions. Coming out 5 years ago to friends and family has freed her up to not only find her true self, but also has given her stand-up a unique point of view and a voice with which to tell it. Please welcome our first panellist, Chloe Black. So I'm going to dive in with our first question to you. I'm going to do this with each panellist as I introduce you. And your bio particularly lends itself to this question.
Okay.
And it's going to just be a small, easy, simple, gentle question to ease us in.
Okay.
But how do you think your identity, your transness, your gender has influenced the way you approach performing comedy, if at all? Because, of course, any of our panellists may say, no, it didn't make a difference, I am who I am, or you might have a more introspective approach and say, yes, it's radically changed everything.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that, Chloe?
I think that, having come out and been doing stand-up as myself for 5 years, as opposed to the rest of the other 15 years, it's a tough question because it's really a matter of, is it less dick jokes or more dick jokes? I can't remember. I think sometimes when I look back at the material I was doing, before I transitioned, I'm a bit ashamed of some of it. I kind of think, oh no, was I really that person? But it also has meant that, it's meant that I explored other avenues in comedy. So it means that, like you said, stale, male and pale. It's a kind of, there's a type of comedy that men get away with, which is I got my premise and my setup, you'll love me, I'm a guy. And then when you're the marginalised person, it's kind of you have to dig deeper and find other subjects that aren't, as bread and butter as a lot of comedy out there. So it kind of, my comedy has kind of gotten a bit more a little bit more daring. I kind of think I find myself exploring topics that I'm trying to make things that are different. So I make jokes about the alphabet and putting words together and what words are funny and weird things like that, with the occasional odd dick joke. So
in the bio that you've given to us there, you used that word freedom, that it actually has the process of learning who you are and becoming yourself and fully inhabiting yourself gained a sense of freedom in your comedy. Yeah. Could you speak a bit more to how that idea of freedom of being yourself has then expanded your artistic horizons?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I lived and did comedy here in Melbourne for nearly 10 years, and then I moved to Hobart. And the best thing that I did was when you're working and doing comedy here in Melbourne, when I was doing it, it felt very much like I want to be discovered. There must be somebody here who's going to see me. My career's going to go through these leaps and bounds, and there's going to be these things that are going to happen if I just keep going at it. And then I took me and my comedy to somewhere where none of that mattered. And so Hobart's very regional. It has a really healthy, lovely comedy scene, but finding out that every gig wasn't going to be the one I was going to be discovered really freed me up to just go, I'm going to talk about anything. It doesn't matter, I'm trying to be, super funny. I'll take more risks. I'll take more adventurous strides in trying something different. I once did an entire interpretive dance piece to some heavy metal music and stuff. And that was and then also tried to read poetry by just in Van Halen lyrics. So it's kind of really freed me up to try some interesting things. So, moving nowhere really helped. But then coming out 5 years ago, it also was just this wonderful blank slate to just really kind of have a platform to talk about anything, which was really nice.
That's so marvellous. So our first panellist, and we'll return to you with more questions and group questions later, Chloe Black. You can applaud, please. I'll go over next to our second panellist, Oliver Reason. Oliver Reason, would you prefer me to be casual tonight and say Ollie, or very businesswoman professional for me saying Oliver?
Whatever you prefer.
Oh, yes.
Ollie's
Maybe
fine.
we're amongst friends and we're sitting in comfy chairs, so I might go for Ollie tonight. Ollie is an essayist and screenwriter. They are the co-creator and writer of Homecoming Queens, an SBS comedy drama web series. Their essays, interviews and criticism have appeared in publications including Overland, Mean Gin, The Lifted Brow, Kill Your Darlings, Autostraddle, Literary Hub, Frankie Magazine, Growing Up Queer in Australia and Dizzy Limits. They are currently one of the Wheeler Centre Next Chapter Fellows, mentored by Maria Tamarkin. Welcome, Oliver Reason.
Thanks.
So the same question to you, that initial question, nice and easy to dive in with. How has your transness, your gender, your journey of discovering who you are and inhabiting it, how has that, if at all, informed or changed your comedy and, in your case, writing practice?
Yeah, when I was asked to do the panel, I was freaking out slightly because I was like, I'm not a comedian, do they know that? Is that okay? But yeah, I was saying this to Chloe in the green room earlier that in all of my writing, I can't not include comedy. And I think it's always been a way for me to, when I'm writing about serious things or things that I feel very emotionally invested in, I'm always worried that my emotions or anger will be dismissed. And I think comedy for me is always a way to be I'm a human and I'm vulnerable in this way that comedy gives access to. And I think that's always been linked to, even before realizing I was trans, I think that there was part of me that was felt the need to always balance that. Because for me, my interest is in all of my work is the balance between the serious and the light, because I feel that's sort of where the humanity is, which is always the central part of my work, I think, or I try to make it that way.
And do you think particularly the importance or relevance of that, even if you're writing for web series for television and including comedy in that, so seemingly just a pure entertainment art form, but talking about that balance between seriousness and light and that anger, because there's a lot of seriousness that comes with living and existing as a trans person in a sometimes hostile world.
Yeah.
And we often talk in the arts sector, particularly for trans and non-binary and gender diverse people, that we really have to prioritise looking for the light against the struggles and for the joy and for the laughter.
Yeah.
And so how is that balance of trying to maybe redress or repair that imbalance where so much in our lived experience as gender diverse people is difficult, is dealing with the serious, is dealing with survival in a sometimes hostile world, and you're going out there and it's quite defiant to actually seek the joy. Could you talk to that a bit?
Yeah, I think, I'm curious what other people feel about this, but I sort of identify kind of a shift between watching trans and queer performers as a kid, who I felt like there was always you made jokes in order to demonstrate that you were in control of the narrative in a certain way. I can, in that very Australian self-deprecating way, I can make fun of myself. If I make fun of myself first, then no one else can. And it was sort of a bit defensive. And I really feel like there's been, in the last 10, 15 years, this shift where it's sort of performers are no, I'm not doing that anymore. I'm using humor as a different access point. It's no longer a defense. It's more just I don't know, just this is who I am sort of thing. And I really I always thought, I feel maybe it's controversial in the comedy sphere, maybe, but that's what I loved about Nanette, which is that it really dove into that shift. Maybe there weren't many jokes in it, but I really that felt so powerful to me, just that exploration of of the shift from self-deprecating to ownership. Does that make sense? I don't know.
It does make sense, and I'm sure some of the other panellists agree. I've seen everyone nodding, but it also kind of then mirrors the way we live our lives on our journeys of from hiding, from self-deprecation into owning who we are and even daring to celebrate who we are.
Yeah.
So I'll now introduce our third panellist for this evening, Scout. Scout Boxall is a comedian living and working in Naarm. For those in our audience or listening at home who don't know, Naarm is one of two original names of this area that we now call Melbourne. Naarm referring to Port Phillip Bay in the Boonwurrung language, and we also sometimes use the word Birrarunga, which is the Woiwurrung language and refers to the area immediately surrounding the Yarra River. Scout Boxall is a By the way, you're welcome for that little nugget. Come for the comedy, stay for the post-colonial education. Scout Boxall is a comedian living and working in Naarm. They came onto the comedy scene in 2018, making it to the Raw National Finals and then graduating from clown school. I feel like that's a dream for many people as children, to graduate one day from a clown school. In 2019, their first solo show, Good Egg, won Best Emerging Artist and was nominated for Best Comedy at the Melbourne Fringe Festival. Scout is currently touring Good Egg to Melbourne and Sydney comedy festivals. Welcome, Scout.
Hello.
Now, I'm not sure if you can guess what the first question for you is going to be.
I haven't been listening this whole time. I've
I
actually just
commend
been
that.
staring
I
blankly at
commend
Ollie's
that.
great glasses and going, yeah, that sounds great. Love that for you.
Well, just for you and for anyone playing along at home, I'm going to be asking for this first question. In what ways, if any, has your transness, your identity, your gender, or for some trans and gender diverse people's identities, lack thereof, lack of a gender or feeling not attached to any gender, how has that, if at all, influenced your comedy and performances?
A lot of ways. I really only started doing comedy in earnest about a year before I came out as being non-binary. And like, thing about stand-up and performing on stage is when it's just you have to be at home in yourself and you have to be on good terms with yourself. Because otherwise, like, you might be going into a very hostile room. You might be going into a shit gig and you have to be able to back yourself and be authentic. And the one thing that, like, people who watch a lot of comedy or write comedy or perform comedy know is that you can smell inauthenticity a mile away. And you can tell when someone is really uneasy in themselves and when they're not confident in their material or, like, how they themselves are presenting to that room. And so I think before I came out, I never did comedy that talked about myself, ever. I didn't write a single joke that was like self-deprecating or self-celebrating, nothing. I was like, I'll make a sketch, I'll make a dumb character, I'll do this, I'll sort of project out and pick out other things that I can work with because I didn't feel comfortable making myself the subject matter. Since coming out, I really have like dived into that and actually being able to poke fun at it. And we're in a post-internet world, which is great. But the whole Nanette thing has really, it shook up the whole game for women and also for trans and gender diverse people and also for queer people. But it also then loaded an expectation on trans, gender diverse and queer performers, which is that if you want to be taken seriously in comedy, you can't just fuck around and make dick jokes and talk about the alphabet and sing Van Halen poetry. You have to have a third act revelation that puts your trauma on the stage, and then you have to resolve that trauma and the audience goes away being like, what a great show. And so, like, I've consciously been trying to resist that. Like, one of my favorite jokes about being non-binary is that what's between my legs has no bearing on my gender. My entire gender identity is rooted in this shit haircut. Which, if you're doing a gig at a pub in Richmond to a straight cishet audience, they laugh and realise that you're not a threat to them, so that disarms them as a threat. But then if there's any queers in the crowd, they recognise that self-deprecating humour as a dig at like the stereotypes that exist within our very niche community around people having terrible haircuts that cost $80 from queer barbers in Fitzroy and all that kind of stuff. So I like to make comedy that is feeding two different audiences, two different things, but ultimately they both still laugh at the end of the day. And I think that's what's really changed since coming out as non-binary, yeah.
That's such a fantastic answer, Scout.
Thank you.
It makes me want to ask to all the panellists now if we might discuss that idea of multi-layered performances. You brought it up in such an eloquent way about playing to two different audiences in the room, maybe the straight or the cis crowd. For those who don't know, who are here or listening along at home, what cis is, shame on you. No. Some people don't know these things. Not everyone can look it up or is safe to look up or find things on the internet or read about them in the library. So cis, spelt C-I-S, is short for cisgender. And that means that you identify with the gender that you were assigned at birth from medical professionals. And part of the reason why the word cis and cisgender is used so often now, a lot of people who are cisgender will complain that it's a slur, but it's much, much nicer than declaring that some people are normal, inverted commas, and some people are trans, because that only serves to dehumanise trans people. So when you hear us using that word cis, don't be scared, it's not a slur, it's just a label like any other so that we can all understand each other until we get to the point where we have full equality, equity and dignity as human beings so that we don't need labels anymore, but that day is not today. So, back to our lovely panellists, can we discuss that idea that Scout brought up so eloquently of multi-layered performances, of having to think of how your performance and how you yourself, who you are as a person, is going to be on stage representing you and your communities to people who have things in common with you and people who don't, whether that's across gender, sexuality, any other things that you might think of. How do we think and feel and approach in our work those layers that Scout has mentioned?
Yeah, I find it interesting because in Hobart, in Hobart where I'm from, it's kind of I'm performing predominantly to cis straight audiences. So, and I have a few jokes that I know go over really well with them, and but I find that it's kind of almost given me a sense of bad habits, because like last night I performed at Queerly Beloved, which is primarily a queer audience, and I found that it was very strange because I kept thinking, these guys are way above or way ahead of this. They're at the advanced level. So it's kind of like these jokes are very trans 101. They're very kind of, I'm introducing myself, introducing people to concepts at the same time. And it's really interesting because like I made a joke about my pronouns, and it is about just that sometimes people and life present you with these unique situations where your pronouns don't necessarily get respected the best ways. But I'm talking about my parents and I say, I was staying with my parents doing Adelaide Fringe. I came out of the shower and my mum said, "There he is, a new girl." And and so I'm able to find the humour in that. Bless my mum, she's in her 60s. She still hasn't got it yet. But the thing is that a straight audience loves that. They lap it up. It's something new and interesting they've never thought of, but they kind of are familiar with it. But I found this audience last night going, "Oh," which is a very unique and strange experience. It's kind of really lovely and earnest, but at the same time, I want them to laugh rather than feel sorry for me. So, but yeah, there is that layered level of it where it's like, I know this, you have a joke where for queer people it's funny and for straight people it's funny. It's very interesting. Like, yeah, it's pretty cool.
Ollie, did you have any thoughts about, particularly for writing for television or screen or web in your line of work, where it's quite a different process to what Scout and Chloe have described, where you can actually read the room and see the people you're talking to and see those layers in a very tangible way, where you're going to pitch those jokes and ideas at. How, in writing comedy for screen and TV, do you approach that idea of a multi-layered audience?
Yeah, it's something I've been thinking about recently, and I feel like I'm in a state of change about how I feel, with how I feel about it. Because I sort of am at this point where I no longer just want to be in this sort of like loop of, I don't know, I'm okay with you, you're okay with me, we are all fine, and then we just like stay there. And I really am trying to like work out the ways, which is very limiting, I find, in Australia, and with Australian audiences of appealing to people and entertaining, but also working out a way that I can like push work forwards and introduce new ideas. And I no longer, I think for a while in my work I was really just sort of like exploiting myself in some ways and exploiting my trauma, and I no longer want to do that. I don't sort of just want to make a spectacle of myself anymore. I want to have really nuanced conversations, and I haven't figured out how to best do that. Yeah, especially in writing, where you don't get that immediate feedback. So yeah, I'm in a state of flux, but I think it's a very interesting question. Yeah.
I know that we started this question with you and some of the thoughts you brought up in your first response, but did you have any, having now heard these amazing responses from fellow panellists, have anything else you'd like to add at that point, Scout?
I think Ollie makes a really great point around not making comedy or art that just appeases and just sits where it's comfortable. But I think the whole multi-layered thing, I mean, the issue with non-binary folks in particular, particularly when we haven't, had the surgery or, gone on hormone replacement therapy, if we haven't physically changed ourselves, like I look pretty much the same as I did 4 years ago and the same as I did when I was 10. Like I've been stuck there. It's been great. It's great for me. But it means that you're constantly having to calibrate your performance of transness and identity and then comedy of like whether you want to be hyper-visible or invisible. And so when you get up on stage and you do material about being trans, you're entering into a hyper-visible space, and that can be really empowering. And it can honestly, like, you might be the first trans person that someone in a crowd has ever seen actually be out about themselves. And with that comes a lot of pressure because you're like, wow, I don't want to bomb this gig. And then they're like, wow, trans people suck at comedy. Fuck that. That's awful. Are we allowed to swear in this? Sick one. We got a thumbs up. So yeah, it's a constant calibration of like, who are you trying to speak to? Are you trying to be visible or invisible? Are you trying to be safe or take risks? And I don't think, and it's unfair to expect any human to be able to have the answers on that. Yeah.
And I think it's something that happens with a lot of marginalised or minoritized people. And I deliberately use those terms with the D at the end, marginalised and minoritized, rather than minorities, because there's nothing small about us in number or in spectacularness, but we've been minoritized in that the structures of society have been built in ways that disempower us. So I deliberately phrase it minoritized and not minorities. But as Scout was saying, there's that unique pressure for minoritized people that we can often be seen, whether it's minoritized across race, gender, sexuality, ability, class, and many other factors, that we're often seen to represent the entirety of our communities in a way that someone who society has lifted up and privileged as the default normal of society, which is usually, unfortunately, a straight, white, able-bodied, middle-class male, doesn't have to represent the entirety of that identity in ways that, as Scout said, the hypervisibility has dangers and responsibilities maybe to our communities, because we may be the only representative of our community that someone has seen. We may be responsible for informing the views of a whole lot of people about transness. So I wondered if each of the panellists, if you feel comfortable, maybe wanted to talk to how that has impacted you or what that's been like in your journey as a performer. That idea of responsibilities to your community, the impact on your community, that your visibility as a representation of transness or of non-binariness or of gender diversity or of queerness. Similarly to the first question, it might be, no, I reject that in my work because I know that there are as many different ways to inhabit gender as there are human beings on the planet. So I'm not interested in thinking about whether there are responsibilities or dangers of visibility or representation. But you may want to then take it in the direction and say, yes, I've thought about it a lot. Here's all the things that keep me awake at night. I leave it up to you which direction you want to take this question in. But who would like to dive in and start to untangle that densely knotted twine of this strange question that I've put to you?
Yeah. Does anyone else want to go first? Oh, okay. Cool. I find it interesting because I kind of... my brain did that thing. My brain does that thing where it starts on the track and then just goes, oh, nah, where were we going? I think maybe that's the ADHD talking. That's all right. But someone else want to take off and I will actually regroup and I will come back when I've worked out what I'm saying. But I'm usually better at this. No.
Go for it.
I'll jump in and then, Chloe, you can jump on when the train comes back.
Okay, thank you. This is community right here.
Yeah, this is called allyship, guys. Look it up. What was the question again? I've forgotten.
I'll try and do a much more reduced. It's partly my
Thank you.
fault because it was a very
No,
convoluted,
but it was beautiful,
dense
and your voice is so
question.
gorgeous that I could just. Oh,
It has been suggested to me that I should do some ASMR track,
oh my God, yes.
which I
Yes,
think would be very
yes.
profitable also, from what
Do it.
I've read on the internet.
Cheeky little Patreon. Get amongst it.
But so really, to crystallise this question into something much more digestible, being a representation of your community, whether that's trans, queer, gender diverse, often comes with that feeling of responsibility or danger of being a representative of your community, that burden of representation. And so I wondered if each of the panellists would just like to unpack how that's worked in your lives and your approach to it, how you feel about it, how you work with it, whether you reject it, whether you embrace it and take it on.
Toot toot, I think a train came in. Sorry.
Yes, she's back, baby.
That's right. I find it interesting because when I perform and I always feel, well, I've often joked with my friends that trans people so often have this stereotype that they're all a bit, we're all a bit uppity and that we're maybe, what I feel from audiences sometimes is this pulling back where they're almost like, are we allowed to laugh at this? I mean, they feel almost that there's a sense of preciousness about us and our identities, which is, of course, nice and warranted, but sometimes I almost feel like I don't want to treat my identity with kid gloves. I want to talk about the nitty-gritty of it, about being misgendered or about coming up against transphobia or having weird, odd, uncomfortable encounters with people. And people are often, I get that feeling from some audiences where it's like, are we allowed? sort of thing. And then I feel like, oh no, like am I representing that part of my community that has that stereotype aimed at them if people are feeling that way? So I kind of try and make a conscious effort to really subvert that idea that we're all precious and we're all feeling that there's some things we can't joke about. I mean, I like to be obviously to elevate the status of trans people and not sort of throw us under the bus for a good laugh, but that feeling that's like, okay, I've been living this way for 5 years and I've been dealing with it most of my entire life. I know my shit. so yeah, there's that feeling of like going, if I represent my community at all, it's that like we have a sense of humour and some of the things that happen to us, although they're odd and awkward and weird, maybe sometimes a little bit painful, are still funny. So that's kind of what I reckon there.
Before any of the... Oh, am I still on? There we go, thank you. Before any of the other panellists dive in on that, I just wanted to pick at that a little bit more. Do you think there's something in the experience you've just described about the difference between laughing at and laughing with?
Yeah, I think there is a big difference there. I think, and I guess I am inviting people to laugh with me when I talk about different things. I mean, I talk about the looks that people give me in the street because I don't necessarily have, for me, I don't feel like I have passing privilege very much. And so people stare and people look, and I actually start giving these looks little names, and I'm saying, people give me, the unicorn, which is the look people give you like they've just seen a unicorn, which is a bit, and that's usually followed by a look which is like, is anybody else seeing this? Or the other look for that one, which is, oh my God, I've only read about you in books. And so, but I'm inviting people to laugh at the fact that I'm looking at this and I'm seeing this through my eyes and I'm saying like, yes, I see you looking and I see you staring and I can see, and I'm almost kind of playing a game with myself. So it's not like, like inviting people to laugh with me rather than laughing at me. And I'm laughing at them because I'm like, I see you with your weird looks.
Who would have thought that the power of comedy was to make us all laugh together instead of those in positions of power laughing at everyone else? Yeah. Wow. Exactly. You were allowed to laugh at that one. It goes back to what we just discussed. But Ollie, Scout, do either of you want to dive on this wild question about representation and the burden of visibility or representing communities or all that stuff?
Something I think is interesting about these dynamics is also something that we don't often talk about is I really like the American writer Michelle T, and she talks about this quite a bit, where it's like queer people are mean to each other often, and we don't talk about that. And I think I mean specifically or particularly online or in anonymous sort of spaces. We can be really competitive and judgmental of one another. And I don't think that's necessary. I don't say that with judgment about our community. And I don't think it's really like, I don't think it's like our fault. I feel like it's part of the dynamic of that like minoritized experience is that we're sort of like forced into this like, I don't know, insecure and like, and if, I don't know, there's so few opportunities designated to trans people, and if that person gets it, does that mean I won't get it? And so I often feel like that when I'm thinking about how my work will be received, I feel torn between I don't want to have to make myself polite to appease cis audiences, but I also do have fears that if I talk about my personal experience and it isn't identical to someone else's experience of transness, they will equally dismiss me. I don't know if I'm being fair with that, but it definitely is something that pops into my head.
I think that's a big thing, is learning that like not all trans people's narratives are exactly the same. That's something that kind of kept me in the closet for ages. Was I kept thinking, while we're sharing, I'm a cross-dresser and I love women's clothes, and like I feel that somehow that cross-dressing is like this kind of shameful thing. And so, but then I would read about trans women who had similar experiences cross-dressing in their like teens and growing up and stuff like that. And I was like, oh, that's not an alien narrative to that. And so I can realize that's part of me working out my womanhood, was that part of it. So yeah.
So many of my friends, like when they talk about the lead up to coming out, there's always, and even after coming out, there's always like a voice in your head being like, am I trans enough? Like, it kind of like doesn't go away. Yeah. And it can be really like a challenging thing to navigate, I think, with having that sort of little refrain in your head.
And could I also ask at this point of the panellists, and then we might go to Scout for more thoughts on this curly-whirly question, but on that point, how do we think and feel about the idea that as there's more visibility of more trans people in comedy and in the entertainment sector and performance more broadly, does that mean that there's less of a risk and a burden of being the representation that people see? And when I say, that there's more and more of us, even sitting here tonight as one of 4 trans and gender diverse people on stage at a major festival, at the start of my own career 10 years ago as a performer, to even find often one trans or gender diverse performer in a festival's lineup was sometimes a challenge, frequently a challenge. So there is increased diversity, increased inclusion, increased representation. Do we feel like that's beginning to change how we feel, that we don't feel that risk of being the sole representative of our communities?
Yeah, I think it's so important, even just in the sense of it gives both performers and audiences, cis and trans alike, like a vocabulary for understanding these experiences and being able to make work about and around them more broadly. That familiarity is so important. Yeah, just for a new language for performance. Yeah.
And so that Scout can be seen as Scout on stage, and Ollie as a writer can be seen as Ollie, and Chloe can be seen as Chloe, rather than as representing an entire segment of the community who all have very different lives and very different stories.
Yeah, for sure, absolutely.
Scout, did you want to attempt untangling the ball of yarn of that initial question?
Yeah. The representation thing is weird because normally, majority of gigs, you're just trying to get people to laugh. Like you don't have time to think about representing an entire community. And also for the non-binary thing, because like I consider non-binary to be like an umbrella that encompasses so many other identities, which is such a diverse experience anyways. It's like there's no point. But what does interest me about being like the model for that particular marginalized group is something that a lot of people in comedy complain about a lot more at the moment, which is like just tokenism. And it's getting complaints from both sides of comedy, because folks on the left or like progressive voices within comedy are like, you can't just put one person of colour on a lineup of 20 people and use them as cover because it's a majority all white lineup. Like, that's still shit behaviour. Or like, you know, just because you've reached gender parity in your room, that doesn't make it a safe room. And it also doesn't make it like a room that women want to gig in or whatever. And so something that I think is really important about, I think it was Ollie mentioned, about having a diversity of like trans narratives in comedy and in writing or whatever, is that there's not just one slot. It's not like the comedy festival gets one trans woman and that's the only person they put up. Because what happens when you have one spot at a table is that everyone tears each other down trying to get to that spot, and also the person on that spot then becomes elevated to not only be on like an artistic pedestal but also a moral pedestal. And it's not fair on them because they just want to make comedy. They just want to make people laugh at dumb shit. And so, yeah, and I've seen that happening, particularly as this is now less of an international festival and it's more just a local festival, and all we have a local acts to work with, and it's really stripped bare the fact that there's a lot of work our comedy community still has to do to be a true cross-section of like Melbourne just by itself. And yeah, the other thing about like representing all non-binary people, representing all trans people, it really, like, it kind of sets you up to fail in a way. Like, there's no way you can succeed at that.
Yeah.
But then also there will be times when you'll do what you think is a really dumb set full of dick jokes, and then you'll come off stage and you'll be like, well, that was cooked. I'm going to go have a dart. And then some kid at Crab Lab will come up to you and be like, I think I'm non-binary. And I'm like, oh, I'm not ready for this. I'm not ready for this right now. But you sit with them and you talk with them, and they tell you about stuff, and then they're like, and then I really, you know. So it's a privilege, but it sucks.
Yeah.
I think it also just about that, the pressures of that pedestal. It's like it automatically, it automatically places a charge on the work that the author of that work hasn't necessarily put there.
Exactly.
Which is so difficult, like, because so much of creating a work is constructing what that charge will be. And so it's like if it automatically gets to like the trans or the queer charge around it, like there's like this limit to what it can be, which is just limiting.
It's like it gets so like politically and emotionally loaded, and you feel like people are either not like Chloe described earlier, like they're either not laughing at jokes because they're like, oh, can we laugh at that? Like, you've just put your trauma on stage, can we laugh at that? And then if they are laughing at jokes, like they're laughing slightly too loudly and they're sort of looking around and like, aren't they funny? Aren't they funny? They singular, aren't they funny? And I'm just like the joke or don't like the joke, or like me or don't like me. Like, don't supercharge it full of like a referendum on whether you're woke, essentially.
Yeah, it's like I find that funny because it just sort of ties into that question about queer audiences and straight audiences, is that when I find that and that goodwill, but also that loadedness, is when I come out on stage and I say I've been living full time now for 5 years, and it goes one of two ways. Either the crowd erupts with like the support and applause, which is kind of nice. It's kind of nice, and I make a little joke about like, you know, oh, don't worry, it's piss easy, it's fine. And then, but the opposite happens is that people just kind of look at me stunned as if they're not sure how to take that, and then I have to kind of work out what to say, and usually I end up saying, yeah, I know, everyone's doing it, and so, you know, but it is that sort of, it's loaded, it's suddenly loaded. It's like, either I talk about having lived as my true self for this amount of time, and audiences go, yes, wonderful, wonderful, we love it, your trauma is yummy. Yeah, no. Or it's like, are we allowed to laugh at the trauma yet? That's, you know, the other feeling as well. Like, you know, and then the, you know, a common occurrence, which I've discussed with other trans women comedians, is having to establish that you're not an act, that you're actually trans. You know, like I've felt audiences pulling away because they're not sure whether I'm actually just just doing some sort of, hey, I'm the trans comic, whoa, when I'm actually, this is who I am. It's like, yeah.
I literally had a chat about this with my mum the other day. She went to see Patrick Collins' show. I'm Not a Mime. It's an amazing show. Go see it. It's one of my top 3 shows of all time. It's fantastic. And
I've met him. He's wonderful.
And it's actually, spoiler, gender comes into it. There's a gender bit. And my mum, I recommended my mum to go see it, and she went and saw it, and she was like, I loved that show. And then I was like, what did you think of the gender bit? And then she was like, oh, I just thought that was a bit of a joke at the end. I didn't realise that was real. Oh. And I was like, no. Oh, God, you were so close. But, it's like you have to establish that you're real.
My mum and your mum should get together.
Yeah, our mums would. They'd probably be, support network for mums of trans people. Yeah, but, like, you have to establish that you're, like, legit. And then also there comes within that a risk of, like, the whole charmed circle thing of, like, some transes and non-binary people are allowed because they don't upset the apple cart, or because they have passing privilege, or because they're palatable, or because they're commercially successful. And then it then gets very tempting if you hop in that charmed circle to let other people just fall by the wayside and be like, neo-pronouns, yuck. Or like, oh, I remember Catkin back in the day, for anyone who was on Tumblr in 2010. It's very tempting to then just, like, sort of hang shit on your community to people who are not in that community. And I've caught myself doing that before.
I think it's interesting too, because, like, there are at least 7 or 8 trans women doing comedy that I know of in Australia. There's probably more everywhere else, but it's interesting because a few of us are making leaps and bounds, but it's interesting. I really want everyone to do really well. I want everyone to just kind of, get above their station and do really well. But there's also that tiny part of me that's a little bit competitive, and also a little bit worried, because for each success that happens, that I worry that person is like the person that everyone looks to as being the trans, like, ideal. So it's like, someone's looking at another comic and thinking, wow, they're so pretty, and they pass really well. And then for the straight cis audience, they go, well, she's wonderful because she's really pretty and really funny. And for us that don't have passing privilege, it's like, I just write really fucking good jokes. So, ignore this, listen to this. But then, but that worries me. It's like, I don't necessarily change my voice. I feel like I need to change my voice. And I was like, well, if a trans woman that becomes incredibly successful has voice training, does that mean every deep voice trans girl trying to do comedy has this bigger battle ahead of them? Because Mum and Joe Gogglebox will go, well, it's not like that pretty sounding trans comedian. So that's this is the stuff that keeps me up at night. So.
And as we've gotten closer and closer to unravelling that ball of yarn of a question, it really reveals that a lot of these issues faced as trans and gender diverse comedians actually speak more broadly as symptoms of global systems and society-wide systems of very intricate ideas about who is normal, who is not, who is celebrated, who is tolerated, who is not, and much broader than the comedy scene alone. But with just over 10 minutes left before we wrap up, that would lead me to my next question, which is, what do you each feel is the power of comedy, of performance, of what each of you do, or of our peers who are trans and gender diverse comedians? What power does comedy and performance have in changing the way that the world has disempowered or discriminated against trans and gender diverse people? What are some of the ways you've seen that in action in your own lives or by watching other people's work? And how do you feel about that? Does it make you optimistic? Do you feel like it's a very challenging and strange tightrope that we're all on that could fall at any moment? Or any other reaction? How is that all feeling and looking at the moment?
I think comedy has a wonderful power to be, like, subversive, and so for me personally, I like that you can broaden people's horizons or broaden people's minds about things that they've never encountered before by saying, like, this is my, like, my first-person view of that, and you share that with people, and they go, she has all those weird things as well. She feels awkward all the time, or she is worried about X, Y, Z, and that kind of creates a communality. And I think some of the best comedy nights and performers, especially, are people that unite their audience in a common realm. And whether it's observational comedy or united in an idea about something that they all don't like, or you unite an audience in this mutual kind of almost. So it's kind of like a form of mind control. It's really cool, but
I was going to say empathy, but mind control. Good too.
Sorry, mind control, empathy. I get those two so confused. Sorry. I'm always empathy. Yes.
Comedians are psychos. Sorry.
But I
Sorry
did
about
want
it,
to dive in
guys.
on that to then ask you
Yeah.
about empathy,
Yeah.
about whether. So do you feel like with that collective feeling, that commonality and communality that you can create in comedy, do you feel like there are often people in your audiences who might never find themselves empathizing with a trans person in any other setting, on the street, whether they were reading, for some reason, critical literature or essays or a think piece in a lefty newspaper, or who would never empathise, but then through humour and comedy, through your performance, manage to find themselves relating to you and empathising to you across that divide in identity.
Yeah, I think that's what you would hope. I think it's interesting because there is still lots of discourse about trans people and trans identities, especially in the Australian, and they obviously have their take on TERFs and TERFdom, trans exclusionary radical feminists, and trans women's access to women's spaces and things like that. And it's almost like I've been saying to my friends, like this whole argument we've been having about trans exclusionary behaviour. It's something that we've been dealing with for 10 or more years or something like that. It feels like we've been having this secret war. And now with people like J.K. Rowling, kind of has made it this secret war a bit more public. And it's kind of created this narrative for people. And so there is this kind of it's kind of scary. It's kind of like, there's these thoughts and ideas that aren't necessarily very inclusive for us that are going around. So I'd love to think that comedy could actually make people go, I read that J.K. Rowling article, but then I saw this trans woman and she was really funny, and they enlighten me that then we're not the boogie person to be afraid of, or that we're not trying to catch a glimpse of side boob at the gym or something. Delving into some of my own material there, but anyway.
Ollie, I might go to you as well on this question, because it does link to a lot of what you mentioned in our very first question about finding a common humanity.
Yeah, I think what I want from all art, not just any art, any medium, is a moment of transcendence when I'm no longer in my body. I'm just totally connected to the artist, and it's strange and wonderful because they might be just talking about their experience, and I'm connecting to them having not had that experience, but because it's triggering something in my brain that's about my total private experience. And I think that, gender's wild, and whether
Groovy, man.
you are a trans person or a cis person, it's like we're all, or most of us, are assigned a gender at birth. And that's kind of the same. And there isn't really much difference. I mean, there is, but there is less difference than we think, I believe. And I believe in that ability to sort of walk back, for art to walk us backwards from that difference. I lost my train.
It's great. So we've covered mind control and we've covered Vulcan, mind meld, and Scout. What are your thoughts on the power of comedy to change minds or change the world? Or it sounds very lofty when I put it that way, so just forget that I said that last bit. But
I was going to make a joke about how we've locked the doors and now we have everyone's personal details. But it's not a joke. I think the sort of sub-question you posed about whether comedy presents a unique opportunity to bring people on side that otherwise wouldn't happen, I think that absolutely exists, because a lot of people who go to a comedy show did not enroll in gender studies at uni, and they
Thank goodness.
thank Christ, because honestly, that's all my material, and then they just know what the punchlines are. And you're coming to people in a place where, essentially, if you can be vulnerable and authentic on stage, not hang too much shit on yourself, and make them laugh, even if they fundamentally, politically disagree with everything you stand for and your entire existence, they're like, oh, they were funny though. I think there is a unique way in of finding people at a point where they're vulnerable and their hackles aren't up and they're not feeling hostile. Yeah, I think there is potential to do that. I don't think it's any of our responsibility to do that, but I think we all do it anyway. Yeah.
Do you think that it has to do with maybe humanizing, that people who, because, the sad truth is there are a lot of people in the world currently who don't see trans people as human, or see trans and gender diverse people as deeply corrupted from humanity. Do you think there's a humanizing aspect to that, where coming and seeing each of you or your work, or experiencing your work through the screen, suddenly for the first time, or as a kind of cumulative effect, as they see more and more queerness, transness represented, are able to suddenly go, wait, these people are human too, and funny, as Scout said. Is it something to do with not just empathy, but humanizing?
Absolutely. It's just being a human and being honest in front of another person, because anyone who hates trans people probably don't know any trans people. I've probably never seen a trans person in the flesh. They've been reared on bigotry and misinformation and right-wing Murdoch beat-ups and internet conspiracies. I don't know, but and by just being yourself and being a flesh and blood person and being human in front of another person, or I think it really is a deeply humanizing experience, honestly. And I think it was like the post Stonewall and the movement of everyone just come out, wherever you are. Because as soon as someone has a personal connection, even if that's a fleeting personal connection to someone they saw at a comedy gig once, as soon as someone has a personal human connection, you can't hate another human being. You can't be in the same space as them and still harbour that kind of abstract hatred. So I think by being out and on stage, or out and on the screen, or writing, or I'm so sorry, I don't know how screenwriting works. By doing that, I think it's a deeply humanising experience. And we're essentially just copying a lot of shit to try and make it easier for people who come after us, which is what our trans forebearers did as well.
Yeah, for sure.
What a fantastic sentiment to maybe start wrapping up today's session. But of course, for those in the audience today, as well as those who may be listening to this recording afterwards, just another note, maybe a public safety, public service announcement. That being said, if you yourself are a trans or gender diverse or any description of queer person who's still grappling with coming out and discovering your gender or your identity, if you're in a situation, whether that's a family situation, a work situation, an education situation, or a political situation where it's not actually safe to come out and do so, that's not on you. We have these amazing people on stage with me today, and many others who are currently carrying that torch of visibility. So if it's not safe or possible for you to come out, that's okay too, and we're here with open arms when you're ready. I just like to add that note whenever we talk about the importance of visibility and coming out, because the reality is, sadly, it's still not safe for many people to do so, and we wouldn't want those people to endanger themselves. Also, for everyone here tonight, as well as anyone listening to this recording afterwards, if any of this has been triggering or distressing to you, or if you're still questioning and trying to figure out who you are and would like to talk it through with someone, you can jump online and look at QLife, switchboard, or rainbow door. And those services will be able to chat through anything about gender and sexuality that you might be grappling with. They're confidential charity and volunteer-run services. So they'll look after you if you need to chat after this. So thank you so much to our panellists for tonight. Scout Boxall, Oliver Ollie Reason, and Chloe Black. Just before we send you all out into this inclement weather, I will just ask all of our panellists, are your shows at the Comedy Festival still going, and would you like a quick plug?
Ollie, do you want to go first?
I'm not doing a show on this festival. I'm a freeloader. I'm a hanger-on, but loving it. But I have done some like little spots here and there, but those were all awesome, and you all missed out. But
And you mentioned that you're currently living in Hobart on
right.
Palawa country. So
Yeah.
if any of you know people in Hobart who would love to see some great queer and trans comedy about alphabets and anxieties and
Yeah,
other
for
things
sure.
like that, send them along to Chloe.
yeah. Oh, I'm doing my full show on June 3rd, actually, in Hobart. I forgot.
Yes.
There we go.
So buy a plane ticket or send your friends who are
that's right.
already there. Ollie, I know that currently we have some of your work viewable on SBS as web series, and what other things of yours are out there on screens at the moment that people could experience?
There's nothing on screen, it's just Homecoming Queens.
Homecoming Queens on SBS as a web series. Scout, Good Egg, is that still going this season, or have we wrapped up already?
It's finished, but there's an extra show on Saturday at 4:30, but I think it's sold out. I'm really sorry. If you know anyone in Sydney, I'm doing 3 shows in Sydney at the very end of April and beginning of May.
No one in Melbourne admits to knowing people in Sydney.
Please.
So once again, thank our panellists for today. Scout Boxall, Oliver Reason, Chloe Black. I'm Mama Alto. I've been your host, moderator and chief investigator today. And again, just acknowledgement to Melbourne International Comedy Festival and the Wheeler Centre, who have co-presented today's Jeez Louise session called Transplaining, with trans comedians talking all things trans. Get home safely. Enjoy seeing some more comedy gigs. There are hundreds of gigs on. You can probably go down to the box office or the information booth just down the road as we speak and see some shows tonight. Have a happy comedy festival. It runs until April the 18th, so still plenty of time to see things. Get home safe, and thank you.
Visit wheelercentre.com for the best in books, writing and ideas from Melbourne, Australia and around the world.